now. And at this point, Alan, if you could record, that would be terrific.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Sarah Shemlansky. Before we jump into today's event, I would like to offer a land acknowledgement on behalf of myself and NEADS. Many of us here today are settlers calling in from across the lands that are now called Canada, and it is important to acknowledge that the land from which we join are the traditional unceded and unsurrendered territories of the First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people. Myself and NEADS are located in what we call Ottawa, Ontario, which is located on the traditional unceded and unsurrendered lands of the Anishinaabe Algonquin Nation. As a settler on these lands, I recognize that it is important to acknowledge and remember the first peoples on whose traditional territories I work, live, and play. These lands were often taken through violent, non-consensual means, and colonial violence and structures persist in our society today. As settlers, it is crucial that we examine and understand our positions within the oppressive colonial structures and work in solidarity with the diverse Indigenous peoples of the land as they fight for their rights, recognition, and representation. As such, I commit to educating myself on anti-racist and decolonial practices and unlearning the internalized colonial biases into which I have been socialized. It is important to remember that a land acknowledgement is only a very small step in ongoing work towards disrupting and dismantling the harmful colonial legacies and structures built into our everyday lives, and we cannot allow them to become token gestures. Instead, we must remember that genuine land acknowledgements can act as sites of potential disruption to work towards undoing Indigenous erasure and remind ourselves of the violent colonial histories of the territories on which we live, work, and play. They also serve as a reminder to think critically about what more we can do to build better relationships with the Indigenous peoples of these lands and work towards reconciliation. If you would like to learn more about the land on which you live, you can visit native-land.ca.
Thank you very much, Sarah. We have 4 panelists for today's event, and I'm going to let them introduce themselves in a moment, but I'll just name who we've got. We have Heather Willis from Toronto Metropolitan University, Emily Hartman and Stephanie Evans from Wavemakers, and Alexis Buchan from the Center for Research and Work on Disability Policy. So to start us off, can you tell us a little bit about your organization and yourself and the work that you do? And Heather, I would like to start with you.
Sure, thanks, Elizabeth. So my name is Heather Willis, pronouns she and her. I am the Accessibility Coordinator at Toronto Metropolitan University, which is a university in downtown Toronto. I lead an initiative called Access TMU. I'm a disability graduate, disability studies graduate actually from TMU from about 20 years ago, from when the program first began. And I'm a lifelong wheelchair user.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Heather. I'd like to pass it over to Alexis next.
Thanks, Elizabeth, and great pronunciation on my last name.
I was working on that one.
Yeah, it's great. So I have a number of different affiliations. I am a postdoctoral fellow at McMaster University in the Department of Economics, where I'm studying disability inclusion and the green economy, so interest in disability inclusion and climate action. I'm also an advisor and consultant working with the International Disability Alliance, and I'm an educator and instructor at McMaster in the School of Rehabilitation Studies, and a former contract faculty member at Laurier Brantford in the Social Justice and Community Engagement program, and an adjunct faculty in the Critical Disability Studies program at York, as well as connected to the Center for Research on Work Disability Policy. So a number of different roles I currently have right now, which keeps me quite busy in addition to my personal life. So I have a number of pets who you may hear at some point during this talk, hopefully not, a young child who's not here right now. I do not have lived experience of disability, but I've been working in allyship and in solidarity with the disability movement locally, nationally, and internationally for about 15 years now. Thanks.
That's great. Thank you so much. And I was very excited when I heard Laurier Brantford. I don't often hear of people that are also from Laurier Brantford. So wonderful. That's one of my alma maters. Stephanie, I'd like to turn it over to yourself and then Emily.
Hi, I'm Stephanie Evans from St. John's, Newfoundland. and I'm in my last year of social work at Memorial University. I identify as a disabled student, and I've been with Wavemakers for about 2 years. I started as a participant in the program, then they asked me to be a member on the board of the directors. My role on being in the board is helping make decisions when it comes to the Wavemaker program. For example, when the topics of students are involved, I give feedback or ideas or other things relate to the students. The Wavemakers programs was a challenge for me for the better, because if you had known me for 2 years ago, you would have never seen me as a panelist. Public speaking is a fear of mine, but Wavemakers helped me through that. They believed in me. During the program, as a group, we came up with an idea to reduce barriers. We created the Pocket Guide app to help people find which stores, parks, buildings, sidewalks, and more that are accessible. The app crowdsources reviews from users to help map out accessible areas around the world. Receive customized accessibility ratings through our advanced filtering feature with available training options for businesses and a points earned system that can later benefit businesses.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. And Emily, I would love to have a few words from you to introduce yourself. And if you'd like, tell us maybe a thing or two about Wavemakers, just for some context for folks who may not know about the program.
Certainly. I am so excited to be here, and tough act to follow with Stephanie's introduction. But my name is Emily. I am the Director of Student Engagement for Wavemakers. I'm an educator, I'm an artist, I'm queer. I have a chronic condition, and I have the privilege of passing with that in most of the things that I do. I work with lots of organizations in a volunteer capacity, like Steps to Flourish, which is a student-led mental health organization, also from one of our amazing alumni. And I also work with Start Proud, which helps queer undergraduate students to connect with professional networks. To tell you a little bit about Wavemakers, we are a groundbreaking virtual reality career building program, and our whole mission is to give Canadian students the opportunity to thrive in the workplace of the future. We are funded and supported by the Government of Canada through the Innovative Work Integrated Learning Program, and our program is all about supporting students to develop and strengthen their skills and future-proof capabilities to connect with leading employers, build networks, and gain experiences that are going to help them stand out in the future and to really understand themselves as skilled, capable, and ready for a future of work that in many ways is quite unknown.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. I can see that there's going to be such a rich conversation this afternoon. I'm wondering if our panelists can share any initiatives or work that they are doing that incorporates the National Accessibility Week theme of disability inclusion from possibilities to practice. And just to make sure that people have voice breaks, I will switch up the order a bit. So I am going to start with Alexis this time.
Thanks, Elizabeth. So when thinking about these questions and just having gone through that ridiculously long list of involvements I have, I wanted to focus on something that really came top of mind for me when thinking about disability inclusion from possibilities to practice. So part of my work involves working with nonprofit organizations to support their organizational development and strategic planning and decision making. So that's part of my role with the International Disability Alliance, which, if you're not familiar with it, it's a global organization of organizations of persons with disabilities. So an organization run by and for people with disabilities that includes 14 other global and regional OPDs, or organizations of persons with disabilities around the world. They do a lot of work in the global south as well as a bit in the global north, and they're currently in the midst of working on their strategic planning process. So I've been working with them to develop a theory of change for the organization. So this is a process where they're thinking about, what does disability inclusion mean to us? What does it mean from the perspective of people with disabilities around the world? How do we promote a transformative society? And so thinking about this really long-term goal, we've been working through how to connect with all of their various members and all of the members of their members, so lots of people engaged in this work, to think about how to achieve this long-term goal of disability inclusion, which can seem really lofty and sort of utopian in a way, and break it down into preconditions and outcomes that can lead towards that, all the way down to their specific strategies in their organization, and thinking about what their short-term strategies and activities are, what their short-term impacts and outcomes are going to be in the next 3 years in order to reach this longer-term goal, and then engaging other people with disabilities with a particular focus on underrepresented groups of people with disabilities, which includes people, NEADS people, people with psychosocial disabilities, labeled with intellectual disabilities, women, Indigenous people, LGBTQ people, like diverse people with disabilities in that work as well. So it's really connecting the sort of short-term immediate work with in their practice with these big possibilities for transformative change and connecting people based on that goal. And I think this is something that can be adapted in the education system at like an institutional level, at a departmental level, and at a program level. I'm a big fan of thinking through what change do we want to achieve in the world and how do we want to get there? So that's what I wanted to share about that.
That's wonderful. And I think, really thinking through how we can apply it in this post-secondary context, which some of our audience will resonate today with, is really timely given, the new education standards that are being rolled out through the AODA. Just before we move on to the next panelist, can you very briefly just share what a theory of change is for folks who might not be familiar with that term?
Yeah. So a theory of change is anytime like a program or an organization or a group wants to articulate what sort of social change they want to achieve in the world. And then so identifying what that goal is, and then working backwards from there to think, what do we need to achieve in order to achieve that goal? And what sort of activities do we need to do in order to help us reach these outcomes that will help us achieve our goal? So it's kind of like a logical way of thinking about why you're doing what you're doing and what you're hoping to achieve with your activities. I hope that makes
That's wonderful.
sense in a
It
nutshell.
does.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you so much. Heather, we'll go to you next.
We'll talk about a hard act to follow. So I've spent a lifetime involved with various initiatives, boards, and committees, starting from the time of growing up in an institution for disabled children. That was really sort of how I became politicized as a young teenager. Currently, so aside from my work in accessibility, personally, I'm currently involved. I sit on the board of directors of Citizens with Disabilities Ontario, which is an organization of disabled people and allies focused on social action, disability rights. So really from a real advocacy perspective. And I also sit on the Metrolinx Accessibility Advisory Committee. So these are very different roles. One is from the sort of lived experience. Well, they're both around a lived experience perspective, but whereas one is sort of directly action from disabled people and allies, the other is an advisory role to a large publicly funded organization. But what they have in common is the opportunity to influence practices and therefore possibilities by providing a lens of the experience of lived disability.
And sort of just to clarify, Metrolinx is
Yes. So Metrolinx is the organization that operates Go Transit in Ontario. So it's a provincial organization, and is also connected with Metro Toronto transportation as well. So it's about making sure that transportation is accessible to people with disabilities. It's a very large
Perfect.
bureaucratic organization. So those advocacy roles are quite different.
Yeah, I can imagine. And one sort of is sort of by and with people with disabilities, and one is probably more broadly some folks with disabilities, but lots of people at the policy level and at the municipal and government level. So different sort of
Yeah,
conversations happening in different spaces for sure.
absolutely.
Yeah. Great. So Emily, I will pass it over to you. And if you want to think about something that maybe you're personally involved with that supports the National Access Week theme, I would love to hear it.
Fantastic. I love this title, From Possibility to Practice. The possibility of true inclusion and belonging has always existed. I can imagine that each of us here has felt or had an experience where you did feel included, and of course experiences where that was not felt. I love this title because it really is our collective responsibility to believe in this possibility, and it's also our responsibility to, in basic terms, really do the work and put this into practice. In my personal life, something that I do across the board is really elevate personal stories and always operate from an assumption that people want to belong and that there are ways to make that happen. In our program, it looks like additional work time, multiple ways to participate, recorded sessions, synchronous and asynchronous content. I think when we work from a place of understanding that diversity is a fact, and our work is for students, it really allows us to try to work towards bringing that possibility to life and really bringing it into practice. Yeah, and I think Stephanie probably has lots to say on this
Yes,
too.
Stephanie, I would love to hear something you're personally involved with that supports the theme for this year, from disability inclusion to possibilities to practice.
Perfect. So recently I have reflected on my experience with having a disability and realized that I had so much potential and I should take more risks. So lately I did a media campaign with the Coalition of Persons with Disabilities with Mary Walsh. COD is a provincial cross-disability organization that educates and advertises community stakeholders interested in advancing the status of persons with disabilities. COD advocates for an inclusive and equitable society for all Newfoundlanders and Labradorians living with disabilities. In the commercial, I talked about my experience with having a disability and the barriers that I face and what we need to do for work towards a barrier-free society. I also been working on 2 projects where I'm working with OceanWise, focusing on mental health, accessibility, and the environment. OceanWise is a nonprofit organization where there's a mission to empower communities and individuals to take action to protect and resource our world's oceans. I'm also working with Apathy is Boring to be a tabletop topics youth leader where I will host and plan events around the topic of accessibility. They work year round to support and educate youth to become active and contributing citizens to Canadian democracy. I've been part of Mundisc at Memorial University, where I advocate on campus for students who need support. I would also like to add, don't let anything stop you from reaching your dreams. You will never know what will happen when you try.
That's a really great philosophy, Stephanie. I think you might have just found the theme for next year's National Access Week. I don't know. It's something that we could pitch for sure. But I just wanted to pause and say that we at NEADS are very familiar with Mundisc, and they are a friend and partner of ours. We were actually at Memorial University of Newfoundland in November of 2022, and we had a wonderful opportunity to hear from students, student leaders, and faculty with disabilities about barriers on campus and some of the initiatives that are being being undertaken to support removal of those barriers. And we had a wonderful opportunity to engage in your student space, which is, if I understand correctly, one of the fully accessible spaces in Newfoundland with an accessible stage. So that was incredible. And I'm so thrilled that you mentioned Mundisc. So big shout out to them. Our next question, I'd love to hear about efforts or projects that your organization has taken on in the 2022-2023 year to become more accessible and inclusive. And if you are part of more than one organization, which I think many folks are, feel free to just pick one that's a real pride point for you, something that really stands out for you. So I'm going to start with Emily this time.
Awesome. Thanks so much. We are constantly trying to put the possibility into practice, and this is an ongoing effort. This is work that is never done. But a couple of the things we're really proud of that have happened this year to increase accessibility and inclusion, but more than that, also really foster belonging at the center of what we are trying to do. We expanded our avatar expression. So this means that students have much more ways to adjust how their avatars look and experience in the virtual world. We know that representation is so important, and this is an exciting development. We've worked on developing new partnerships and expanded our partnerships with organizations like NEAD, working with groups like Autism CanTech, Norquest Student Services, Guelph's Community of Practice, and CAMH. And I guess the other piece that I would say is so important and we're really proud of is the genuine inclusion of student voices. We do this with having students in our board, students like Stephanie, but also creating a space in virtual world where students on their own, in their own time, do feel a sense of belonging and kind of can bring their whole selves or as much of themselves to the program as they like. We work to make sure we're removing barriers by having things like financial support and actually making that available sooner as students express need, and having new tech advancements for our platform like voice to text and text size. There's more to be done, but these are some of the things that we're really proud of this year that have increased our inclusion and really help towards our big goal of having students feel like they belong.
That's wonderful. And Emily, I just want to sort of pick up on a thread you mentioned. You were talking about voice to text. So would this be on your platform, your website, or is this something you're advocating? Excellent. Okay, I just wanted to
the one
pick up on
specifically
that.
is for our platform. Voice to text is new. It's sort of in beta. We're excited to have it working across programs, but it's been a challenge to get that up and running. And we do work with an external partner on our virtual campus, but we really advocate for more inclusion, and it's exciting to see that those advocations are being taken seriously.
That's wonderful. I'm going to move next to Heather.
Okay, so I'll speak from the perspective of Toronto Metropolitan University and my role there. I mentioned that I had an accessibility initiative called Access, and as part of that initiative, we have 4 key action pillars around education awareness, tools and support, community engagement, and accountability. So pretty much everything that we do falls under one of those key pillars. We also have a variety of working groups. We currently have 3 active working groups that are working to remove barriers in particular areas. So these include the built environment, information and technology, and universal design for learning. So some of the projects that we're undertaking are, we have an accessibility website. We're currently in the process of refreshing that website. In particular, we're creating a whole new section on challenging ableism. We're increasing the guides and resources that are available on our accessibility website, which most of them are around sharing resources about how TMU community members can be more accessible in their day-to-day practice. So For example, there's information on there around creating accessible content, on how to make events accessible, captioning, ASL, that kind of thing. So we're reviewing those and sort of filling in the gaps. We've got projects around wayfinding and emergency evacuation happening. In addition to engagement with both our Employees with Disabilities Community Network, we're collaborating with them on the creation of a video which exemplifies the experience of employees with disabilities and the supports that are available to us. We're working with our student engagement group, collaborating on events and working on an awareness tool that is really aimed at students. We have our mandatory employee AODA training that everybody has to take, but that's really around employees, and we want to develop something specifically for students. So those are a few things that we're working on right now.
That's wonderful. I just want to pause and acknowledge that yes, this will be recorded. It is being recorded now. So somebody popped a note to me in the chat. So I just want to acknowledge that. And also, Heather, I just wondered if I could pick up on a comment you made. You're building an accessibility website with some key themes. Who is the target audience? So this would be students, staff, community members, all of the above.
So we've had this website in place for many years. We're currently refreshing it. Our slogan is accessibility in the classroom, accessibility in the workplace, accessibility on campus. So
Gotcha.
those resources are aimed at the entire community. Some will be of more interest to students, some to faculty, some staff. So the whole range.
Wonderful and very needed for sure. Stephanie, I'd like to turn to you next. A project or an effort that your organization has taken on in 2022-23, and sort of if you can speak a little bit about, how that's helped to become more accessible and more inclusive. And I know Emily has started, so if there's something you want to pick up on, feel free to go ahead, or maybe you want to talk about a different initiative.
Okay, so I know that being part of Waymakers, that being inclusive is very important to us. Having that connection with each participant is very important, so we know what support they need to succeed in the program. Also, being on the board, having that lens, and being that voice for students is very important to me. Recently, I helped out with the new Wavemakers magazine. I talked about my experience with having a disability and in a new program like Wavemakers. Let me tell you about the new program is scary, especially when you have a disability. Because for me, I wasn't sure that it was going to be accessible and accommodating. But meeting with the Wavemakers crew, they were very supportive and understanding and was willing to help with any obstacles that could cause me to have anxiety with starting a new program. Some of the other very helpful accessibility and supports were one-on-one support for students after the program ends, LinkedIn endorsements, and Wavemakers senior team often serve as references for students applying. With the virtual campus, it was accessible where it was online and not in person. Also, since it was a virtual reality, there was avatars and people got to get to know me and not Stephanie with the disability. The program was very helpful because with the help of my group, my mentor, and the staff, I was able to try something new that I wouldn't have done. And being able to create a project, work on my self-growth, and make strong connections.
That's wonderful, Stephanie. And I was listening as you were speaking, and something that really resonated with me is the ways in which this program really incorporates so many principles of inclusion just in the very core of how it's built. So for example, this flexibility, you can do the modules or do the work when it suits you, that it's online, that there's virtual reality avatars so that people who perhaps are a little bit shy, or perhaps people that need some time to kind of think about what they're going to say and how they're going to say it, can interact comfortably. So I'm just, when you're speaking, what really stuck for me was how this program at its very core is built to be inclusive for everybody, but it really helps people that traditionally maybe couldn't take part in a WIL program because of the rigid structure of the program. So just something I was thinking about as you were speaking. And Alexis, over to you.
So now it's my turn to have tough acts to follow. I will just share one example that again kind of came top of mind when thinking about this question. And part of my role as an instructor at a couple of different universities, I recently took part in an accessibility subcommittee as part of a larger program coordinating committee in one of the programs I was teaching in. And so the program coordinating committee was comprised of a group of faculty, full-time faculty in the program, professors, who talked about program development, curriculum development, and so on, and how to engage. So my work there was part of that larger committee, but then there was this subcommittee focused specifically on how to advance and enhance and increase accessibility in the program. So the subcommittee included myself, as well as another tenured faculty member and a couple of students who identified as people with disabilities. And we worked together to talk about what accessibility means. We developed a set of shared understandings around that in alignment with the principles of inclusive design for learning, which is sort of similar to what Heather mentioned in terms of universal design for learning, but it's a more of a one size fits one kind of approach where you are constantly asking who is missing from the design of the particular system in which you're working within. So this inclusive design for learning approach was something that we brought to the program coordinating committee, who apparently in the past had not taken up much of the idea around advancing accessibility or inclusion. They were not doing a terrible job of it, but hadn't really engaged in strategic discussions around it. And so when we came together as a group, the subcommittee, and presented this particular approach with certain principles and values to follow, it actually prompted discussion among the program coordinating committee to take on for the following year, which was actually pretty exciting because it had sort of been something that was left on the side of people's desks and wasn't really put on the agenda. So we got it on the agenda, which was really great. And the way that we worked was we tried to model the ideas of accessibility and inclusion as much as possible. And then the students themselves took it on themselves to survey and talk with other students in the program about their experiences with accessibility or inaccessibility and inclusion and exclusion in the program, and then share that back with the staff there. So I'll just share that one example because I think that was sort of most relevant to our discussion here.
Yeah, and a couple things that stood out for me for sure, and Emily's popped some things in the chat here: anticipate and build from foundation. So I love this idea of being proactive, not reactive. And so building accessibility in at the core. And then the other piece that I love is this one size fits one. I think sometimes there's a little bit of a misconception with UDL or UD that it's one size fits all. And it's not, it's the opposite. It's being able to be flexible and nimble and engage with people in multiple ways. So I think what you've said there is really poignant, especially when we're coming into an age now where so many of us as TAs and instructors and leaders are thinking about how do we bring people back, given that we're still, COVID will be with us, more of an endemic, but we're coming back to in person, but still making sure that our learning is inclusive. So I think there's a lot of really great points to think about there. So what obstacles have you experienced in pushing these projects or efforts forward? Funding,
yes,
time?
I'm going to send you another link. There's another thing going on a webinar. I'm just switching to that one.
I think there's maybe somebody not on mute, who's perhaps so if we could just remind everybody to mute themselves, that would be great. Thank you so much. So I'll just read that question again. What obstacles have you experienced in pushing these projects or efforts forward? It could be funding, time, or resources. And I'm going to start this time with Heather.
So all of the above that just mentioned for
It's like I
sure.
read your mind.
Funding, time, resources, absolutely. But you know what is connected to all three of those things is attitudinal barriers and biases. Because really, if you can get past those, if you can change people's perspective, then it's interesting how that can impact resources, times, and funding. Those things are obviously a reality, and I know, thinking about when we think about resistance around individual accommodation, for example, often these are related to uh, resources, whether it be, I don't have the time to do this, I don't have the funding to do this. And so what we need to do is remove those barriers. And that's part of the initiative that we have around our website, and putting resources right there that people can easily access, providing that support to them. So we need to remove those. But I would say that attitudinal barriers are probably the biggest obstacle, and they're related to all of those others.
Yeah, for sure, because it's all about, what we prioritize, right? So if we don't prioritize accessibility or accommodations or innovations in our budgets, it's because we don't believe it's important. Or if we don't allocate staff to that initiative or that project, it's because we don't believe it's important. Or maybe we believe it's important, but we don't believe it's a priority at this time. So the attitude for sure coils around all of those. Emily, what are your thoughts?
I just love what Heather had to say so much about attitude, and we're really fortunate on our team to have a really inclusive, positive attitude around belonging. It's like many folks have said today, it's really at the core. To your question about obstacles, yes, I would say we try and have an attitude around technology as or a mentality, I guess, that it can be a great equalizer, but it does not always work like this. And technology is not a neutral, unbiased entity. I mentioned a few successes around our tech, but there's a long way to go to really making this work for even more people. It's a matter of innovation can really empower inclusion and drive it. But it really does have to be considered from the beginning. We chose this platform because it's accessible in remote and rural areas. It doesn't require a VR headset. It doesn't require a gaming computer. And so if we hadn't been thinking about those things in the beginning, we would be in a potentially very different position. The other obstacle I would add is that we can always benefit from working with more partners. We have some incredible experts on the team around DEI, but there's no one better to work with than the folks who have disability and access as their main focus. And so I'll put that out there as well, that we're trying to work with and learn from more partners, and we are deeply collaborative. We will let you know where the sharp objects are in VR education for sure. And so partnerships is something that we can always expand on.
Yeah, and so many things you said resonated, but I want to pick up on a couple of themes and threads, and thinking about accessibility more broadly. So, the cost of participating in a program could be an accessibility barrier, or the fact that somebody may not live in an urban center with high speed or 5 Wi-Fi might be a barrier. And so I think the way you've built your system takes, of course, into account accessibility from the purely disability lens, but then that more holistic approach of accessibility, thinking about who are we not letting into our virtual doors because our program right from the get-go isn't accessible, either because of cost or because of equipment that's needed. And the other piece there that I think really stood out for me was, again, this idea that if you're proactive, you can minimize some of those costs and that time that's spent addressing accommodations and accessibility afterwards if you're building it in up front. So I think there's some really nice examples there in what you're saying with your program. Alexis, over to you.
Yeah, I want to, really agree with what Emily and Heather have already said, and that, so many of the so funding, time, and resources, yeah, indeed, all of the above are challenges, and I think it's really rooted in the fact that it's not given priority. It's a systemic problem. It's an institutional problem. It's not accounted for in budgets, and it's not even, it should be part of the requirements in order to do any work, really. But I'll harken back to the example of the accessibility subcommittee as part of the program coordinating committee in particular. So really, the main challenge here was limited time and resources for the subcommittee. So our subcommittee comprised of, like I said, students and myself as a contract faculty, and we took on this work because of our passion and commitment to it, but it was really unpaid labor for all of us, and it was on top of already demanding work and school load that we were managing, so it made it hard to put in as much time and effort into it as we would have liked to. And then on the other side, from the program coordinating committee perspective, they also had limited time and resources, overworked faculty, not enough teachers and capacity in the program to take the time to stop and reflect critically on what they were doing and strategically think about how to implement a more accessible and inclusive program. And this was directly linked to not enough support from the administration for that kind of work. So it's a common issue across a lot of different initiatives, but that was some of the primary reasons why our work gained some traction, but I'm not sure how much momentum it will be able to sustain.
Yeah, and I think you've touched on a really important point, invisible labor, emotional labor, and unpaid work, or working to work, as a mentor of mine likes to say. And I think quite often in the disability space, and perhaps in other EDI spaces as well, we do so much of this work because it's a passion project or it's a personal project, or there simply is no one to do it. But we burn out and we become tired because it's like we've said, on the side of our desks, or we're trying to push forward an initiative and it's a small but mighty group. So I think that's a very important point to bring up, is the fact that it's hard to sustain things when you have an unpaid team, or a team that isn't really designated to doing the work, and is perhaps kind of doing this as a side project, because then it becomes a challenge to sort of balance all those priorities and projects. Stephanie, is there anything you wanted to add there before I move on to the next question?
Nope, everyone said it perfectly.
Wonderful. I just wanted to give you a chance. That's perfect. Thank you. So accessibility within institutions often falls to disability services offices, or DSOs, and sometimes we hear those offices referred to by other names. Could be accessible learning, accessible education, or falls to a small number of staff within EDI, equity, diversity, and inclusion offices. So how can we shift the culture within organizations to move accessibility from one or two offices or a handful of individuals to being an institution-wide priority? And I would like to start, if I could, with Heather.
Okay, I think this is such an important question.
I agree.
So first of all, you say that it's often left to one person. I think first what we need to do, I mentioned Access TMU, our accessibility initiative. We have a set of principles and values that really underpin the work that we do. And these principles and values have been just huge in terms of changing culture. And I'd like to highlight a few of these that speak directly to your question. So first of all, we need to differentiate between the approaches of accessibility and accommodation. People often use these terms interchangeably, and I see them as different approaches that are two sides of the same coin. So I often say that accommodation is what you do when you don't have accessibility, or when accessibility is not enough, because we know that we can make the environment as inclusive and as accessible as we possibly can, and some people are still going to require individual accommodation, and there's nothing wrong with that, but there's a relationship between the two. The more accessibility we have, the less individual accommodation we're going to need. So just even getting people to understand that is really helpful, because they see the difference between systemic change and being proactive, as you mentioned earlier, Elizabeth, whereas accommodation is more reactive. And as I said, I see these as two sides of the same coin. They need to be working together. So in my role, I am the only person that's responsible for separating accessibility and accommodation. They are directly related to two different pieces of legislation. Individual accommodation, all universities have a responsibility to provide individual accommodation to the point of undue hardship under the Ontario Human Rights Code. I'm speaking to Ontario. As accessibility is related to the Accessibility for Ontarians with Disabilities Act, and I realize there's 5 provinces now that have adopted accessibility legislation. So those two pieces of legislation, those two approaches, as I say, need to be working together. And in my role, even though I'm another principle of Access TMU is collaboration and shared responsibility. So just because I'm in my role, I can't possibly be doing it all. So a key part of my job is sharing that responsibility. I mentioned that we have working groups that are working to remove barriers in particular areas. While I got those working groups going and I sit on all of them, I am not the lead. They are led by the department of the university that is responsible for that area. So I mentioned built environment. That is led by our facilities department. I mentioned universal design for learning. That's led by our Center for Access and Learning and Teaching, who are responsible for providing professional development and support to faculty. Our information and technology working group is led by our computer department, and we have an accessibility specialist. So the other thing is just even having somebody in my role, as well as our accessibility IT specialist. A lot of universities still don't have dedicated roles for those. That's begun to happen, and where they sit is really important as well. My role was initiated in our human resources department. That's where when AODA universities had to start to be compliant with AODA in 2010, that's where it landed. But then we hired an equity, diversity, and inclusion lead at the university, and my role shifted to be under the umbrella of equity, and that's really important as well. Where that sits. I think I'll leave it there for now and let others have a.
I just want to stay with you for one moment, if I may. I think what you're bringing up is really important. And so just to kind of help us take this idea of accessibility and accommodations being two sides of the same coin, do you think you could share an example of where a student or a staff member might have needed an accommodation because accessibility wasn't enough?
Well, I think so. One of the things that I'm always striving is to make sure that I'm in communication with our human rights department, with our accommodation for employees with disabilities, and with our accommodation for students, because I need to understand how we can change, how we can shift, how can address those issues that are arising in terms of human rights complaints or accommodation requests, how we can be addressing those systemically. So a student might need to have an entire class shifted to a different classroom because it doesn't have a door opener. So, we have an initiative right now, we just got funding to create more, put more door openers in classrooms. We had another student who was encountering some ableist attitudes within their department. So we approached the faculty's EDI person. Most of the faculties now have EDI initiatives, equity, diversity, inclusion, initiatives within the faculty. So we approached them and we went in and did some education. So thinking about how those issues that come up, how we can address them systemically.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Alexis, I will move to you next.
It was great to hear from you, Heather, and being in the thick of this in particular. So I could go on a rant here, so I'm going to try and be as brief as I can on this subject. But I think, accessibility within institutions falling, within particular departments, I think is a clear reflection of how accessibility is marginalized and deprioritized in a lot of ways. So I think one of the key ways in which to create some culture change is to address policy barriers, really as a complex issue. And I'd like to suggest, I think what could be really helpful is consider co-designing these policies or co-redesigning these policies with students and faculty and administration to bring in these sort of multiple stakeholder groups. So people with lived experience, people who are impacted by the policies, and those who will be implementing the policies in order to make them more effective. So for example, thinking about accommodation in connection with accessibility, as I was teaching a course and one of my students needed a bit more flexibility on the due dates for the assignment. So currently the way that the structure of the time frame for the course is inaccessible to them, I guess you could say. So they came to me individually and asked for extensions as an accommodation and disclosed that they had a disability. So I was informed by the program that I needed to refer that student to the accessibility services office or whatever it was called, to go through them, to get registered with them, and then come back to me, and I would be able to make the accommodation officially, which felt really disruptive in terms of our direct connection. I just would have granted the accommodation, knowing what I did, and the student, when I told them that, really didn't want to go to that office because they said they felt like when they have been forced to identify as a person with a disability, which they didn't always want to do, they felt that they were immediately treated differently by their instructors, by the program, and their expectations were lowered. So they hesitated in connecting in that way. But I was sort of constrained by the policies of the university in order to do that. And I thought, this should probably be looked at. I understand that the policy was there because some faculty might have been very resistant to providing an accommodation, and so the accessibility services office needs to help facilitate that. But it created this sort of weird dynamic between the student and I felt really uncomfortable about it. So I think that's one key thing. But more broadly thinking about accommodations too, I think one of the ways to create some really profound culture change is when people want an accommodation to provide that accommodation without the need for any sort of medical documentation. And I just published an article on this for my dissertation. I think it's really important that we address this sort of myth-making disability and be really aware of what sort of processes people have to go through in order to receive an accommodation or to have an inaccessible space made accessible for them. So that's, I think, another way of providing some change. And then, of course, providing more funding, more time to make accessibility and inclusion planning part of, say, in an education system, and part of a faculty workload. So via like course releases, for example, maybe even hiring students as research assistants or teaching assistants to help support that process, and then evaluate the accessibility and inclusion of programs across the institution. So I'll stop there, but I think it just requires a lot of system change.
Yeah, I just want to pick up on something that you said before I remind Emily and Stephanie of the question and continue on, and that is this faking disability or faking a need for accommodation. And one of the things that I'm very passionate about addressing is this topic of imposter syndrome through a disability lens. And so I think sometimes what happens, especially in academia, is we feel like we don't really belong, or there was a mistake and we didn't really get it, admitted on our own merits. And I think those fears are heightened when you have a disability and you are maybe asking for extra time, or you are maybe asking to do something a little bit differently. Because I think academia is so rigid in its structures and its processes and how and why we do things, that when we sort of disrupt that a bit, or we change that a bit, that kind of imposter feeling can come quite strongly as a student and as a learner. And we're sort of always having to address that. Like, how do we say, I'm still actually getting what I need to get out of this, but I may be doing a little bit differently. So it's something that really resonated with me in your comments. So Emily, I'll turn to you. How can we sort of shift this conversation of accessibility out of disability services offices and not out of, but broadening from disability services offices and EDI offices and making it, embedding it in the culture of institutions. So, broadening it out from one or two spots.
It's interesting. I'll share two thoughts, and I'll keep them brief because I really do feel that Alexis covered them. The first one is to just make it easier for students to submit or make known their needs and to respond with action. Of course, disclosure is not a simple issue to the point around medical documentation, but that process is often complex with lots of steps. It's not made clear to students. So it should be made easier, and we should listen and respond quickly. I think doing that allows more students to get the things that they need, and even more students can see and experience what happens when you are able to go in and ask for what you need and see the effects of that. And the second piece is to really slow down and involve others when planning the practices that you're going to implement. It makes me think of a time in university. I was in a brand new equity studies building for a critical disability studies class. There was great audio, lots of space for mobility devices, wide aisles between seating. But at the front of the classroom, there was no space for, by the podium, there's no space for a wheelchair. The assumption being that perhaps students with disabilities or mobility needs would be in the room, but certainly not the professor, which is like a very problematic assumption. And, this building then was not properly accessible. I think a greater social understanding of neurodiversity and mental health is starting to help. And it's starting to affect the way we can have that culture shift, but there's so much more to be done. And I'll leave it there.
Great. Thank you. Stephanie, is there anything you'd like to share, add about shifting that culture, broadening it from the Disability Services Office or the EDI office and having it there, but broadening it to include a culture of accessibility institution-wide?
Yes, I have a few suggestions. So, understanding biases and building awareness is the first step towards real change. Leaders can start by addressing this by helping employees understand how individuals are impacted by unconscious biases and what actions need to reinforce biases. One way to build awareness and address unconscious biases is to encourage every employee to review, question, and analyze their own personal biases and assumptions. Another suggestion would be diversity training, helping employees understand how cultural differences can impact how people work and interact at work. It can cover anything from concept of time and communication skills to self-identifying and dealing with conflict. The diversity training that is offered is optional, tends to be more effective than when it is mandatory. It is crucial that leaders are clearly communicating why training is taking place and problems you're trying to solve and what comes next. They will keep people motivated and also help them understand how the learnings tie back to broader company goals. Another thing that comes to training is the willingness to spread awareness and be comfortable with the word disability.
Thank you very much. So just thinking about, as individuals with disabilities and allies, how do we address the concern of cost when it comes to accessibility in our advocacy work? It's often a barrier that's cited, so I wanted to take a few moments to have a discussion around how we address this concern. So I would like to start with Alexis.
Sure. So I think one way is really just to straight out ask to be paid more than what you want for our work. And that when labor is unpaid, it really reflects the undervaluation of our knowledge and expertise. So, I've heard so much from different groups and organizations and individuals with disabilities about they're so sick of being consulted over and over again and asked to volunteer on these committees that look really prestigious and like a really great opportunity. And of course, people want to have their voices heard and they want the opportunity to participate, but it's often it can be unpaid or very low wage kind of work. So that I think is starting to change. Like more often now people are receiving some form of compensation, but I think it really needs to be demanded, and that, you know, lived experience knowledge needs to be appropriately. So constantly, I'm always bringing up the need myself for the need for a compensation that's at least a living wage, and provided in a way that does not harm people's social assistance, because sometimes if people are on some sort of social assistance system, an influx of money can affect how much they get. So important to have those conversations. But also being open to opportunities outside this sort of capitalist regime, and knowing that there is a lot of power in volunteer work untied from like institutional and organizational mandates and commitments. So, you know, I think a lot about the work that's happening with disability artists and art, and how that's sort of outside of those bounds, and some of the beauty that can happen when volunteers come together. I just think there needs to be a better balance of that. So harnessing the power of community, as well as another way I think that's been really innovative in terms of reusing and sharing items and resources. So thinking of examples of like lending libraries of tools. For example, there was an example of that in Waterloo where people had, you know, physical like hammers and screwdrivers and tools and drills and things like that people could share. And in Hamilton, there was an initiative to create a lending library for assistive technology, which was another way in which to support people to gain access to those things, especially if they wanted to use it for advocacy work, but that wasn't a requirement of it. So those are some of my thoughts on that question.
Thank you. And Emily.
Thank you. Cost. It's really interesting. I mean, funding is always something that we talk about, and access to funding. But I'll say as well that the cost of not being inclusive is too high. The cost of not changing the minds of employers around who's well suited for a role is too high. The cost of not actively welcoming more students into programs is too high. And yet, my personal opinion is that it can be dangerous to use that model exclusively, that says, you know, being inclusive is good for business, because we've seen how EDI projects or initiatives, especially with that sole mindset around being inclusive is good for business, we've seen how they've panned out. They often don't create a sense of belonging. They can get abandoned. They can get not fully actualized. We see lots of directors or VPs of EDI leaving roles and having high turnaround, because that mentality is not really about deep, meaningful inclusion. And that can result in greater tokenism, exclusion, discrimination, and microaggressions. So I think there's a balance there around the cost, and maybe not in that financial literal sense, but the cost of the ideas and the innovation that can happen when we're not being inclusive. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, especially given that, you know, our population is aging. We have 22% already of Canadians that live with a disability, and that's actually expected to continue to rise. So thinking about that, you know, the cost. You're right. If we're not inclusive, who are we excluding from our workforce, from our businesses, from our educational institutions? Absolutely, those are really, really good points. Heather, I'll turn it over to you.
So I think first we have to acknowledge that cost restraints are a reality, right? There's been, you know, in the university environment, there's been tons of cutbacks. The impact of COVID, you know, it's just a reality. So I think we have to acknowledge that that's there. But what we need to do is elevate the priority. And Elizabeth, you were speaking to this earlier. We have to make the powers that be, you know, the folks that hold the purse strings, understand the importance of accessibility and inclusion, and that when we're creating more, you know, accessibility for individuals with disabilities, it's going to benefit everyone. You know, kind of a if you build it, they will come sort of thing, right? So and how we do that, we've already talked about that in so many ways. You know, it's about education, increasing the awareness. Um, I talked about our principles and values. So another one is intention. You know, that when we're not being intentionally inclusive, we might be unintentionally exclusive. So it's not about placing blame, but understanding that we need to be intentional, and that includes funding and cost. Um, I totally agree around the business lens, not necessarily with Emily around the business lens, not necessarily being the best approach. But you can speak to that as well, right? So when you create more inclusivity and accessibility for students with disabilities, you increase your enrollment, right? So that's beneficial. So I think you need to create more awareness and make it a priority.
Great, thank you. And absolutely, I think sometimes, just to your comment around awareness, we don't know what we don't know, right? And so I think sometimes, and I've experienced this as a student, you know, when I bring up an accessibility concern, the response is we never would have even thought of that. And so you're right, like we don't know what we don't know. So raising that awareness and building it into the culture is really key. Stephanie, anything to add there? Oh, sorry, go ahead. Of course.
I'm
Yes.
sorry, Elizabeth. There was one more
okay.
thing I just wanted to add, which is again going back to shared responsibility. So this is a way to address costs. So an example would be, it's early, but we're already talking about collaboration around International Day of Persons with Disabilities in December. So International Human Rights Day is the following week. So we're looking at collaborating with our human rights services and having a key event, but they're having a number of smaller events that are hosted by other departments around the university, where they will take on the cost of that event and the cost of the accessibility. So sharing that responsibility across the university.
That's, you know, that's interesting because we within our student union in the last couple of years have actually designated an accessibility fund. And when it came out, I think there was a little bit of misconception that it was only to be used for events about disability or accessibility. And we were sort of pushing back and saying, no, anybody who's running an event can use this fund to make their event accessible. And so I think, you know, to your point, it's that cost sharing, but also sort of just bringing this conversation to the table about, you know, how can we share the responsibility of making events inclusive beyond just events that focus on disability and accessibility.
Right.
Yeah. Stephanie, is there anything you'd like to add there about cost?
Yeah, as a person with a disability, the best advocate is yourself. When it comes to the questioning, it's best to use your voice your concerns, and willing to have the conversation. And when we have those conversations, that's when change starts to happen.
Wonderful, thank you. So again, that raising awareness piece. Our final question before we move to a little bit of Q&A, and I am seeing some starting to pop into the chat. What's next? Given this year's theme of possibilities, what do you see as possible? And Emily, I'm going to start with you. And if we can maybe just try to have our answers be about a minute or two, then we'll have some time for Q&A if that's at all possible.
Yeah, thank you. I think in terms of possibility, we're really hopeful and actively working towards building networks, new communities, partnerships, and of course, hopeful about funding. We are hopeful that we can work towards using technology and skills development learning as an enabler of innovative inclusion when we are particularly thoughtful about it. And we're confident that it's possible and will happen that more students can access work integrated learning who haven't been able to before in sort of traditional ways, because what we're offering is something that is for everyone, but very much for them and for us, right? For the community that needs it and has been underrepresented in those kind of traditional co-ops and internships. And I'm going to leave it there. I know Stephanie has some awesome stuff to say, and she can run that for sure.
Wonderful. I'm going to turn to Stephanie next. What's possible, or what do you see as possible? What's next?
Okay, so the improved disability access infrastructure to make participation and inclusion easier for people with disabilities. Programs must make sure that all activities involving people with disabilities are accessible and meet their needs. For example, meeting times and invitations should be sent far enough in advance to allow this necessary. Also, more people with disabilities need to be the focus of engagement initiatives in order to co-create knowledge and learning that are representative of the larger population of persons with disabilities. Programs looking forward to input on design should seek out a diverse range of community members, researchers, and advocates with disabilities. Additionally, co-produced knowledge can assess other players in development and policymakers in mainstreaming more fruitful disability inclusive procedures and in their initiatives.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Stephanie. Those are great points. Heather, what's possible?
So going forward and what's next, in my role, you mentioned earlier about the education standard under AODA. So in my role, that piece of legislation that doesn't exist as yet, it's a form of recommendations is going to be a really key tool moving forward. The AODA as it exists is really aimed at the business community. And we know that we can be completely compliant with AODA and still have tons of barriers. And the education standard recommendations are much more comprehensive and address many of the barriers that specifically exist in universities. So we're not waiting for the legislation. I've been for the last year sharing information about the recommendations and asking how I can support others in implementing those recommendations. In terms of what's possible and a vision, we have some things that we look to in terms of a vision that include things like, we're a university where events are fully inclusive, where dismantling barriers is a welcomed and encouraged dialogue, where faculty and staff have the resources and tools needed to be inclusive practitioners, where students are able to participate in all aspects of university life, where there's less need for individual accommodation because accessibility just is. These are things that we look to for the future at the university.
I really like that. Bringing the conversation about education standards to the fore even before the legislation is officially rolled out, and that'll mean that you're more prepared and ready to support students and faculty and staff when the legislation is officially rolled out, for sure. Alexis, I'm going to end with you, and then we will open it up to Q&A. So what's next and what's possible?
Great. I'll be really brief because I think Emily and Stephanie and Heather covered it all, but I think this conversation has done something in terms of identifying where there have been some successes. So I think looking at those and using these in order to maintain hope, going back to the conversation around burnout and the amount of labor that's involved in trying to promote accessibility in an inaccessible world is really important. And so, I'm hopeful in the growth of cross social movement organizing, cross disability collaboration. And I'm also hopeful in the power of some newly elected political representatives kind of push back on some of the other political forces that are setting us back in some way. So for example, Sarah Jama is a racialized person with a disability that works very strongly from a disability justice perspective, and she's the newly elected NDP MPP here in Ontario and really challenging some of the conservative policies. So without getting any further with that, that's some of I think identifying excesses, looking with well and harnessing those.
Wonderful. And I think, social and political engagement is so important, and civic engagement. And there could be a whole other panel on how to involve and support folks with disabilities who want to become more politically engaged. So thank you very much, Alexis. So I will end our sort of formal part of the panel there. And now, first of all, I'd like to thank our 4 panelists. That was incredibly insightful, and everybody brought such unique threads and themes to the conversations, but yet we saw so many themes that coiled around each other and really continued to resurface and resonate with folks. So with our last 9 minutes, or I guess 10 minutes, I'd like to open it up to some audience Q&A, and I'm seeing some in the chat already. So you can either put your question in the chat box, you can pop up your hand, and then unmute and ask your question. So I'll open it up now to our Q&A. I did see one comment in the chat. I'll maybe just read it. It had to do with that UW, which I assume is University of Waterloo, that there's one form to indicate disability or medical diagnosis that people have to complete. So I just wanted to acknowledge that comment, and some compliments in the chat for Stephanie about her presentation and her work with Wavemakers. And oh, so Tessa has just corrected me. It's University of Winnipeg. So I apologize for that. And Tessa, if you want to share more about that, feel free, but not necessary if you don't wish to. Other thoughts or comments?
Would it be okay if I
Yes.
just I see that there is a question. So just for Tessa, I'm curious about that, and just wondering, I was going to put it in the chat, but just I'm curious about, it's great to see, first of all, that the form is not related to diagnosis, but I'm wondering who completes those forms, whether it's like a medical professional or the individual requesting accommodations. And is it something that's needed when people are not aware of their functional needs and options for accommodations? And just sort of some questions around that, which may or may not want to be answered here, but something to, I'm just curious about, or something to think about.
Hi, I can, so it's Laura from University of Winnipeg. Can everybody hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. Hi, yeah, so I put in the chat about that, our medical form. The focus on it, it's just more of a generic form. So it's kind of to pull away from having details about diagnosis. So there, students can put information down about diagnosis if they wish, but the focus is on functional limitations and or functional needs, and also on what accommodations they need. So, I mean, students often might, in a meeting, orally discuss with us, what their disability is, which they can, or, it's totally up to them if they wish to do that. It might come up in conversation. It typically does, but it doesn't need to typically be written on the form. And so that's kind of a difference that, folks maybe with mental health diagnoses are just more comfortable with maybe not stating the specific diagnosis on a piece of paper, which is fine. And who fills out this form could be a GP, psychologist, psychiatrist, speech pathologist, OT, kind of whatever fits their need, kind of thing. In remote communities or rural communities, a nurse practitioner can fill out the form. So it just kind of depends on what the need is and kind of where they live. So we try to be pretty open to, getting people registered with us so that they can access the services and not throwing barriers up if possible. A lot of times it's hard for people to get a doctor. At the University of Winnipeg, we do have a nurse practitioner. So sometimes that is suitable for them to go see the nurse practitioner and then get the form filled out. It kind of depends on how complex the health condition is. But yeah, we kind of followed suit a little bit with, can't remember if it was the Queen's University. It was at a university in Ontario where, I don't know if it was 5 or so years ago, that an individual, they took the university to human rights regarding having to state their mental health diagnosis. So that they changed their medical form to not having much diagnosis information written down. I'm trying to remember which university it was. I know it was in
I believe it was York. I think it was York.
York. Okay.
Yeah, I believe it was York. Yeah.
Okay. So we kind of followed suit there and just kind of tweaked ours to be less diagnosed focused.
So more on functional limitations, it sounds like.
Yeah. So functional limitations. So it's kind of a graph from, mildly affected, medium, moderate, severe. So it could be, the scope could be attention, physical limitation, cognitive function, memory. So it's really brought down into chunks of kind of where are your needs and where do your needs not, where I don't need help with. And then on the another page of it is the focus is on accommodations. So what accommodations do you need based on your functional limitations and things like that. So it kind of ties it up a little bit better for us to understand kind of what the disability, like what the needs are. They're coming to register with accessibility because they need something. So kind of tell us what your needs are, and then we can go from there.
And I think, to your point, that's really what it's about, right? It's not about what is the actual diagnosis, but, how can we work with you given this limitation to find accommodations or technologies or supports that are going to work for you. I want to just, I'm noticing in the chat there's some really great conversation and questions. I want to start by addressing Kate's question about if anybody can comment on what post-secondary institutions are doing as we move out of the remote learning phase of COVID back into in-person to ensure that students are still included. Does anybody want to take that one? I know at our institution, there's not a priority currently on remote learning, that it's really moved back into in-person. And I believe that that's going to stay from now on, unless we find ourselves in another wave of COVID.
Heather has a comment on that.
Yeah, go ahead, Heather. Sorry, I didn't see your hand.
Well, actually, no, not on that. I was going to address something in the chat, but so I would say that's the same here. However, I have heard waves that there is more happening around remote learning. I don't think the baby is being thrown out with the bathwater. I think there are conversations happening about adopting learning in more ways. So I don't think we've heard the end of it. But I think there just isn't the infrastructure right now to do both. But I think we'll get there. I think it's just going to take time.
And I want to pick up on that point, Heather, because like I'm sure many of us today on the webinar, I'm a student, but I'm also a teaching assistant. So I sort of straddle both of these worlds. And so as a TA, it was interesting because we had the mandatory return to in person, but then some folks that really wanted to be on Zoom. But the logistics of doing that, the extra time that it would take, and also just the ability for those students on Zoom to feel engaged was beyond sort of what we could offer in that particular course. And so I think what it's going to mean if we want to do that is bringing in either extra supports or thinking about how we teach and what that looks like.
So I just wanted to address, Heather Mitchell asked in the chat about, did I state where it lands as important? And I think she's referring to when I was speaking about where my role sits at the university, and so why that's important. So I said that it was initiated in human resources, and I think where it sits is important because it's in human resources. People often see that as an administrative check mark. They think it only refers to employees, where it really applies to the entire community. I also feel that people don't trust human resources, which is strange. Before I came to the university, I worked in a hospital for many years, and human resources was always helpful. I didn't see as anything. It was pretty. Anyway, I came here and it was, and this has changed. The culture around that has changed, but it just seemed that there wasn't trust. And so, but more importantly, seeing accessibility under an equity envelope is really important, to see it as an equity issue. Again, referring to our principles and values, and I'll put a link in the chat to those. one of them is disability is diversity, not deficit. So we're always talking about the benefits of diversity and how that brings a more enriched perspective on everything that you're doing. But we're usually talking about cultural diversity, maybe 2S LGBTQ, but we're not thinking about disability in that way at all. Disability is something off in the corner that's a problem to be addressed. And what that's saying is that that perspective, the lens of lived experience of persons with disabilities is a valued one as well. So, where that initiative sits under an equity, diversity, inclusion lens is important for that reason.
Thank you so much. I do know that there's more questions. I do want to be mindful of time. So I think what I'll suggest is that we stop the recording and thank folks. If people would like to stay for a few moments, that's wonderful. But I do want to be mindful of the time for our interpreters and speakers and our ASL and LSQ as well. So I do want to wrap us there if that's okay, and thank everybody for coming, giving an hour and a half of your time to talk about this very important issue. I want to again thank our funders, the LSQ and ASL interpreters, the interpreters for language, of course our speakers, and our tech people that make this event happen. So thank you very much, and happy Pride and happy Accessibility Week.
Just waiting for the recording to be stopped here.